So for several weeks we've been in a series of lessons designed to strengthen our faith for the future. And we've looked at the question, what is the world coming to? And of course we know the world's coming to an end, and it seems to be accelerating that way right now. We've considered some Bible prophecies that have already been fulfilled, and looked at a number of those, and seen some of the foundations for prophecy that we know we can trust God's word, because many of those things have already been fulfilled in detail. We've reviewed some of the dangers to study and prophecy, and we've laid out some ground rules for studying Bible prophecy. And then we've looked at a sort of an overall framework of how God deals with mankind in the different ages of history, and looked at some of those foundations. So this morning we want to continue with a couple of foundational prophecies and a couple of foundational passages in the Bible, and also cover a brief survey of prophetic events, just kind of hit a timeline, and then we're going to go into detail in the coming weeks on each of these different events. Now, the book of Revelation is, of course, the first book that people think of when it comes to Bible prophecy in the end times. But we cannot understand the book of Revelation until we understand the book of Daniel. Because Daniel is one of the major prophetic books of the Bible, and God gave Daniel a framework, a structure, and an outline of history and God's plan with the Jews. And we know that history is focused on God's plan of redemption, and God did that through a chosen people. And so many of the things in prophecy relate to the nation of Israel. And so Daniel was given an outline of what some of those historical events would be. And chapter 2 and chapter 7 speak of 4 kingdoms that had ruled in the world. And of course, Daniel started in the kingdom of Babylon, which was followed by the Medo-Persian Empire, and that was followed by the Greek Empire, and that was followed by the Roman Empire. And so Daniel saw this outline of coming history, as well as a future revived Roman Empire with a confederation of 10 kings. And all of that is correlated in Revelation chapter 13 as well. But in a couple of separate events, Daniel looks into the future, and he gives us an outline of those kingdoms as they would arise. The Apostle John in Revelation 13 saw a similar vision, but his order is reversed, because he's looking back on history, whereas Daniel was looking forward on history. But they are referencing some of the same symbolic things there, and so we know that those two prophecies or those two chapters are related. And then as well in chapter 9 of Daniel, we see one of the most important prophetic passages of Scripture, and that is Daniel's 70 weeks. And that is one of the most amazing prophecies in the Bible. And for those of us especially who understand and know that the prophecy should be understood literally, it's essential that we have a right understanding of that particular text as well. So we want to start this morning with 4 major world kingdoms, and those are related in a couple of different visions or a couple of different dreams. So first of all is Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. So at the beginning of chapter 2, we see, now in the 2nd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. And so just some background information here. We're not going to read the whole chapter. But as far as background goes, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. And he's the one who had attacked Jerusalem and had taken captives in 605 BC. Now, what happened historically is that there was a battle between Egypt and Babylon. And I think the Egyptians first attacked Babylon, if I remember right, and then so Nebuchadnezzar went back over to Egypt, and on the way back, stopped in through Israel and attacked Jerusalem. And that was one of 3 campaigns that Nebuchadnezzar did against Jerusalem. But in 605 BC is when Daniel and his 3 friends were taken captive. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were all taken captive and carried back to Babylon, along with a bunch of other Jews. But Daniel and his friends were among the men that were specially chosen to be indoctrinated into Babylonian life and become advisors to the king. So they were to spend 3 years in special training, and they would learn all of the ways and the cultures and everything about Babylon and the way the government worked, and they would be advisors to the king. And that was the way a lot of kingdoms did back then. They would, when they conquered a nation, they would take people from that nation, and that way they had kind of a commonality with the cultures and all of that. So this is what happened with Daniel and his friends, and the mention here of the Chaldeans, that is actually, if you look historically, that's the Magi. So when the Magi came to visit Jesus after he was born, they came from the east. They came from this area of Persia, and those Magi traced back through Daniel and these other wise men. They were astrologers, and the reason why the Magi were familiar with the Bible prophecies, they were watching the stars because of the influence Daniel had had in the time that he was part of that group of wise men. And Daniel spent his whole life as part of that group of wise men. But anyway, one night toward the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he'd only been king. In fact, the reason why he didn't stay long in Jerusalem in 605 BC was because a word had come that his father was dying of it or something, and so he kind of rushed back to Babylon. And so he didn't completely conquer the city at that time. And so he became ruler of Babylon. And so this is at the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And this is when Daniel and his friends were new to the kingdom. And it's either within, this happened possibly within that first 3-year training period or right after that training period. So it's going to be right at the beginning of that. But Nebuchadnezzar had a disturbing dream. It may have been a recurring nightmare that he'd been dealing with, but he was unable to sleep. And so he demanded that the wise men explain the dream to him and help him with that. And not only did he want them to explain the dream, he wanted them to tell what the dream was. So either he couldn't recall it very well, or he was testing them. We don't know which, but he demanded that the wise men tell him the dream as well as the interpretation of the dream. Well, of course, the other wise men couldn't do that, and they were on the way to go kill all of them. Nebuchadnezzar had ordered that they be killed, and Daniel spoke up and said, just give me some time. My God can interpret dreams and tell us the meaning. And so he got a little bit of time, and he and his friends prayed and asked God to reveal the meaning to them so that they could speak to the king. And so that's the background here of the dream that he had. And so down in verse 19, you see it says, "Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in the night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven." And then down in verse 31 is the relation of the dream, and then later the interpretation. So we'll start reading in verse 31. So he says, Daniel was speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on the feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found, but the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So the content of the dream is this great statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw. And there was a giant statue with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, a belly and thigh of bronze, legs of iron, and then the feet were iron mixed with clay. And if you look in the back of your notes, you'll see there's an outline of this statue there. And the king saw as well a great stone which struck the statue and crushed it. Stone cut without hands, so stone came out of somewhere and came and smashed the statue, completely obliterated the statue, and grew into a great mountain, which then covered the earth. So what is the meaning of this dream? Well, Daniel explains this down in verse 36. He says, "This was a dream, now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. After you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so that like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, but it will have the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay. They will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future, so the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy." And so Daniel gives us an explanation of this dream. Now, the statue that he saw is represented here, and the various metals in the statue represent the great successive kingdoms of the earth. And the metals descend in value from top to bottom. So gold is more valuable than silver, which is more valuable than bronze and iron. And that is characteristic of the traits of the kingdoms that they represent. Man's dominion begins with gold and with great, wonderful things, but it devolves and eventually devalues into dust. Now, this basic prophecy of Daniel 2 is repeated 4 times in different prophetic forms in chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10 through 12. But each successive prophecy fits within that same basic parameter established here in chapter 2. It just gives us a little more detail on some of these things. It looks at a few different aspects of it. Now, there were many other kingdoms in the world about the same time as these. I mean, China had kingdoms going. The Mayan kingdom over in, down in Mexico, the Incas down in South America, and so there were numerous other kingdoms around the world. But Daniel's vision relates to the kingdoms that would interact with his covenant people, with God's covenant people, the Jews. And so the world history we get in here is related directly to God's people. So the head of gold represents the Babylonian Empire. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar was the king at that time. And this was not only the most powerful kingdom, but it was the richest. Nebuchadnezzar had tons and tons of gold and silver and all sorts of things from all of the conquests that they had done. Babylon, we talked about that several weeks ago. Babylon was just a beautiful city. Nebuchadnezzar had built the Hanging Gardens, which were world famous. They were one of the 7 wonders of the world. The city had stores. Some scholars say it had enough stores of food and supplies to last for 20 years. So, if it was besieged, there was really no problem for that. They had water coming in, and so they were a self-sufficient and powerful kingdom. Then, the chest is made of silver, and that represents the Medo-Persian kingdom. Now, the Medo-Persian kingdom, just as silver is inferior to gold, the Medo-Persian kingdom was inferior to the Babylonian kingdom. But silver is also stronger than gold, and the Medo-Persian Empire was stronger technologically and militarily in that regard than the Babylonians were. Then we see a belly and thighs of brass, and that represents the Greek Empire. Now, the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great conquered the Medo-Persian Empire and much of the known world. In fact, Alexander the Great was just, what, 28 years old, I think, when he was in control of most of the known world. They had gone and advanced and conquered the lands very quickly and had a very powerful army. But something that's interesting is, this was made of bronze. Well, the Greek Empire is known as the Bronze Empire because the shields and the weapons they had were made out of bronze. And so it is an interesting correlation there in the material that God used in this particular dream. But the superior weapons of Greece and the superior military tactics of Greece allowed them to expand very swiftly and became a very powerful empire. And of course that introduced a common language, Greek, that was spoken across the known world in preparation for the time when Jesus would come, because that was the main language in the time that Jesus was on the earth. But that is the Greek Empire. And
where do the Assyrians fit into that? Are they a Medo-Persia?
The Assyrians would have been before the Babylonians.
Oh.
So they don't fit into this prophecy. In fact, Babylon sort of overtook the Assyrian Empire and conquered the Assyrian Empire along with others.
So Jonah would have been long before David.
It would have been before Daniel, yes.
I mean, Daniel.
Yeah. Because the Assyrians are the ones who took the northern kingdom captive. So remember, Israel was divided into northern and southern kingdoms, and God had judged each one of them. And it was 150 years or something like that before that Israel, the northern kingdom, had been captured by the Assyrians. And then they'd been taken away, and so all that was left was the southern kingdom, and then later they were conquered by Babylon. So yeah, they would fit before this. So after Greece came the legs of iron, which represents the Roman Empire, and the dates that they were on rolled there. Now, iron is the strongest of all the metals that are in this statue, and so it represents the military might of Rome. Rome was a very powerful military empire. They weren't necessarily the richest, but they were very powerful militarily. And the Roman armies were well known in their tactics, and this empire spread from the Atlantic Ocean throughout Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and even Northern Africa. All of that Mediterranean basin and everything was covered by the Roman Empire. And just as the bronze weapons had given Greece an advantage, Rome had iron swords, a gladius. They had spears and armor of iron as well, and so that iron gave them an advantage in their military conquests. And then we see feet of clay mixed with iron. Now, what empire conquered Rome? Any historians?
Apparently not.
No, it's because it's kind of a trick question. Nobody conquered Rome.
Good.
Rome sort of fizzled out on its own. It fell through corruption and was divided with internal strife, but nobody ever conquered Rome. And so just as Rome fell apart from within, initially it actually fell into 10 basic divisions. 7 of those divisions are sort of present in modern-day Europe with the Germans and the French and English and Spanish, Portuguese. So over the centuries, many kings and queens have tried to unify Europe through marriage. Others have tried to unite Europe through military conquest, like Charlemagne, Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, Adolf Hitler. They were all trying to combine or unify Europe militarily. But so far, Europe has never been truly united in a sense. And so just as the iron is mixed with clay. They're not really truly conglomerated. Europe has been the same way, and that's represented by this mix here. And additionally, they have never really been established in a 10-kingdom confederacy. So we know that this has not taken place. This part of the prophecy has not taken place yet, and that will take place in the future. And in fact, we see more details in the other chapters of what's going to happen in that 10-nation confederacy, and they will be united under the Antichrist during the tribulation period. And then there's a stone cut without hands that comes down and smashes all of these other kingdoms and grows to itself. And that stone or that rock represents Christ's eternal kingdom. That is, when Jesus comes at the second coming, he will come and establish his millennial reign with the Jews, and that will be man's final opportunity to come in. There will be a final judgment in the great white throne, and then we'll enter eternity future, and that will be with God on the throne as well. And so that is an eternal kingdom, and that's what that rock represents that came down and smashed all the others. And so that's the prophecy or the framework that we see in Daniel chapter 2. Now in Daniel chapter 7, if we go forward a few chapters, we'll see in chapters 3, 4, and 5, and 6, there's some more details about this prophecy. But when we get to chapter 7, chapter 5 relates the fall of the Babylonians and the entrance of the Medo-Persians. Then chapter 6 is when Daniel serves King Darius under the Medo-Persian Empire. And we see his vision in chapter 7, a vision of 4 beasts. And so the background of this vision is that Daniel had faithfully served King Nebuchadnezzar throughout his 43-year reign in Babylon. And then over that time, then his son Belshazzar was on the throne. And then Belshazzar was his grandson, Nabonidus was his son. And they were on the throne for just a few years in between. And then Belshazzar was the king when they were conquered. That's when the handwriting was on the wall, and he was the king at that time. So when the Medo-Persians came in and took over, they didn't completely wipe out everybody. The wise men and the advisors then became advisors to the Persian king. And so that's what we see in Daniel's 1 through 6, are the life and times of Daniel. And then chapter 7 through 12 describe some of the visions that he had. And what we see in chapter 7 and 12 takes place in the time frames between chapters 4 and 5, between the Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire, or right at the time that Medo-Persia conquered it. And so the first vision here in chapter 7 is the most comprehensive. And there are other ones that are more detailed of a framework within this. And it talks about those same 4 kingdoms that we already looked at. Those are the same kingdoms that are in view. But this vision focuses more on the character of those kingdoms. Whereas we saw in chapter 2, the rise of the kingdoms and their power and riches and all of that, this vision focuses more on the character of the kingdoms. And so it's really sort of looking at the perspective of God, who sees the kingdoms of the world as ferocious wild animals who devour and conquer without conscience. And so in chapter 7 we see, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was also given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth, and thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong, and it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it, and behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. So on the chronology, this happens just before the end of the Babylonian kingdom, the beginning of Belshazzar's reign, and Belshazzar was only on the throne for a few years. So this vision came just at the beginning, just at the end of the Babylonian kingdom, but it's, nearly 50 years have passed since chapter 2. So in this vision, and you'll see these beasts are, I believe, on that same chart that shows the statue. I believe the beasts are shown on there. So, and in here, we see Daniel in the vision sees a chaotic and tumultuous sea, which is the Mediterranean Sea, and then 4 beasts coming up out of the sea. And the first, of course, is like a lion with the wings of an eagle. The wings were plucked, and it was made to stand up like a man. The second was like a bear that was raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its teeth. The third was like a leopard with 4 wings and 4 heads. And the last was a dreadful and frightening beast. And it had bronze claws and large iron teeth, and 10 horns, and then a little horn comes up and sort of consumes 3 of them and comes up among those. So what does all this mean? What are these beasts, and what is it relating to? So this is the chart, I believe, that you have printed out. So you'll see how they correlate with the statue. And you've got these different beasts, and they represent the same 4 empires that we already looked at. So the first beast is the Babylonian Empire, headed by Nebuchadnezzar. And in fact, lions and eagles are, of course, they're both majestic and beautiful creatures, but they were the symbols that were used by Babylon in their decorations. Do you remember several weeks ago when we were looking at the fulfilled prophecies, and I showed you a picture of the Ishtar gate from Babylon? So there's different characters or different animals. If you zoom in, you can see different animals are represented on that gate. And the winged lion is the main symbol of the Babylonian Empire, and that's one of the main symbols that's on that gate, and it is all throughout Babylon. And so that's what this is. It's a winged lion. Now, it says that the beast was humbled, that is, its wings were plucked off, and it was made to stand like a man. Now, this reflects Nebuchadnezzar's deliverance from a beastly existence. If you look in Daniel chapter 4 and 5, Nebuchadnezzar was lifted up in pride, remember, and God judged him by making him basically become like an ox. And he ate grass and lived out in the fields and all for 7 years as sort of a judgment. And at the time, after that time, then he realized, he recognized God, and he humbled himself and repented. And that is what it's talking about here. He was lifted up, he was humbled and lifted up like a man, and that reflects this experience of Nebuchadnezzar. The second beast, again, relates to the Medo-Persian Empire, and it's a bear. Now, a bear is slower and stronger and more crushing than a lion, just like the empire was, and it has a voracious appetite for conquest. And the raised side of the bear is speaking of one of the kingdom's parts being dominant. So remember, it's the Medo-Persian Empire. So it was a combination of the Persians and the Medes. And the Persian side of that alliance was more dominant in the kingdom. And so that's what this raised side is talking about. And the 3 ribs symbolize nations that were devoured by the Medes and the Persians. So the 3 nations that were devoured by the Medo-Persian Empire are Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. And those were 3 major groups that were conquered by the Medo-Persians. Then the third beast represents the Greek Empire. And this one was given authority to rule. And of course, a leopard is known for its sudden and unexpected attacks. They'll sneak up and pounce on their prey. And Alexander the Great very swiftly conquered the world by the age of 28. And the four heads of the leopard speak to the four-way division of the kingdom after Alexander's death. After his death, his kingdom was divided up among his four generals, and that's what this is talking about. And then Daniel's later vision of the ram and the goat in chapters 4 and 5 are related to the second and third kingdoms. Give us a little more detail on this. And then the fourth beast represents the Roman Empire, and it is dominated by its enemies. The horns of the beast express the power and fierceness of an animal, and it had 10 horns. And then Daniel sees a smaller horn growing among the 10, and as it emerges, 3 of the original horns are plucked out. And then the other thing is that this little horn has eyes and a mouth, and it speaks proud, boastful words. And this is representative of the Antichrist, and his gold, his pride, and his attack against the saints as well. And then this is what we see in Revelation 13 with the beast out of the sea. So if you look over in Revelation 13, Revelation 13 and verses 1 and 2. So John is writing here, and the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and the mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. So John is referencing this prophecy of Daniel. Notice he mentions the same 10 beasts that Daniel saw in his vision. He just lists them in reverse order because, of course, John is looking back on time. But he mentions these same creatures, and the personal pronouns that John uses indicate a king rather than a kingdom. So he's speaking of an individual rather than the entire kingdom. And so what John is saying there in Revelation is that the speed of Alexander, the leopard, the strength of Cyrus, the bear, who was the Medo-Persian emperor, and the boastful roar of Nebuchadnezzar, all of those are present in the Antichrist, who is also called the beast in Revelation.
Is this why some people argue that Revelation has already occurred?
Yes. That's part of it, because some of the symbolism is similar, and so people will try to say, well, this was already fulfilled in these world empires. But the events of Revelation have never been completely fulfilled. You have to spiritualize all of the things in Revelation in order to explain them being fulfilled today. And again, what's our main ground rule for prophecy, for Bible interpretation?
It makes sense, then the common sense makes sense, and that's to accept that as the truth.
Yeah, that's right. The common sense makes sense, seek no other sense.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so a literal interpretation, that's why we have that rule, because that's the only way to be consistent in our interpretation. Because if you get into allegory and try to assign meaning to these symbols, you'll find in that system of thought, people are not consistent. They don't assign the same meaning to all these symbols, all the same types of symbols. And they come up with all sorts of different things. But yeah, that's the reason why people try to fit it into modern times and say it's already been fulfilled. But John is simply referencing the prophecy and pointing out that in the beast, the Antichrist, all of those characteristics of these previous kingdoms are going to be contained in this one man. And that's one reason why he's such a powerful leader, because he embodies those characteristics. And then there's phrasing in Revelation that we'll find also here in Daniel, time, times, and half a time. And that is speaking of the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period. And we're going to look at that in more detail at a later date as well. But again, John speaks of the same 10 horns that Daniel saw, and again, referencing back to this prophecy. And although the Roman Empire did devour and dominate the entire civilized world, the 10 horns do not have a literal fulfillment in the Roman Empire. There was never 10 separate kingdoms like that within the Roman Empire. And so what we expect and what we see then is that it's going to be a revived Roman Empire of some sort. Remember, the Roman Empire was never conquered. It sort of faded away as a result of corruption and all kinds of things. But it will be revived in the end times and with the Antichrist. So that is the overview that we see of those 4 major world kingdoms. So now we go to Daniel chapter 9. And Daniel 9 is one of the most important passages. Daniel's 70 weeks is one of the most important passages to understand because it gives us the framework for all of Bible prophecy. So Daniel 9, 24 through 27. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wings of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So what is Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy all about? So it has a foundational aspect, all right? This prophecy gives us a framework for the rest of Bible prophecy because it lays an Old Testament foundation for the major emphasis in Revelation, which is on the 7-year tribulation. And it's also significant because this prophecy can explain the existence of the church age as a parenthesis between the 2 parts of God's plan for Israel. Because that was unknown and that was unseen by the Old Testament prophets. But within this 70 weeks prophecy, we can see a gap, and we are in that gap of time. 70 weeks, and it's mentioned in 6 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week. My math is right. So there's three different groups mentioned there, okay? And the 69 weeks have been fulfilled literally. They've already been completed. So we can be sure that the 70th week will also be completed and fulfilled literally, even though it hasn't happened yet. And so logically, we must be living in the gap between the 69th and the 70th week. And we are just awaiting the fulfillment of that last one. So, so what is the background of this prophecy? So again, remember, Daniel was in captivity in Babylon. He had spent most of his life in Babylon. He had witnessed the entrance there of the Persian Empire as well. So here in Daniel 9, Daniel is in his 80s. He spent most of his life there serving several different kings. And he's in his 80s. So this is approximately 13 years after the events of Daniel 8. The kingdom of Babylon, of course, had been taken over by the Medo-Persians. And so this change of power prompted Daniel to search the scriptures and read what God had said. Because naturally he had questions. And so he was studying the writings of Jeremiah. And when he studied Jeremiah, he realized that God had said that his people would go into captivity for 70 years. Well, he did some quick sums in his head and realized that they were getting close to that 70 years being completed. The Babylonian captivity began in 605 BC, And it was now 539 BC. So 66 years have passed since the Babylonian captivity started. So Daniel realizes that there's only a few years left, and this captivity will be completed. So naturally the question is, well, what happens next? We've, paid our dues, so to speak. We've been disciplined as God promised, and so now what's going to happen? And so Daniel began praying and asking God for the answer to that question. What are you going to do with your people? And so he fasted and he prayed, and he first of all prayed for God's forgiveness, and prayed for forgiveness for his people, not just himself, but forgiveness for his people. And then he prayed for the restoration of the Jews to their land. And then he asked God to show him, what was going to happen. And so Daniel's concern for God's program for Israel resulted in God giving him an outline of Israel's future from that point on. And so, as a result of his prayer, the angel Gabriel appears to Daniel in a vision and explains this vision that he saw. And so, in this vision, God reveals the length, the starting point, and the main events of Israel's future. So, notice here in Daniel 9:24-27, Gabriel is speaking. This is what Gabriel is telling Daniel. So Gabriel says to Daniel, your people, your holy city. So obviously this refers to the Jews, because Daniel was a Jew. So it's referring to Daniel's people, and so this prophecy is related exclusively to the Jews. It's not related to anybody else. So what are the 70 weeks then? Well, the literal statement that's in there is 77s. 77s are determined upon your people. And so it's 70 group of 7. And this was a way that they would phrase years and groups of years. So it's 70 sets of 7 years. Kind of like we use the word dozen to describe a group of 12, right? So it's the same idea. 70 groups of 7. Now, each week represents a 7-year period of time. And prophetically speaking, these are 360 days. A year is 360 days because they're based on a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. And so if you're trying to do math of where it fits and how it adds up, you have to remember that it's 360 days, not 365, because of the difference in a lunar calendar, so they would round it off. But in relation to these 70 weeks, he says that there are 6 prophetic purposes that would be accomplished in relation to this. And you can underline these in your Bible. In verse 24, 70 weeks have been decreed to your people in your holy city. Number 1, to finish the transgression. Finish the transgression. So Israel will stop forsaking God and rejecting the Messiah. So in that 70-week time period, this is what will happen. Secondly, to make an end of sin. So here, their sin, Israel's sin, would be judged and they would be given a new heart by the Holy Spirit. Thirdly, he says to make atonement for iniquity. So Christ's death on the cross then would be made effective in the hearts of the Jews, and their sin would be washed away. Then he says to bring in everlasting righteousness. So to bring in everlasting righteousness, that's in relation to the millennial kingdom, which is going to be a righteous and holy kingdom. And so that will be part of this process. Then he says to seal up vision and prophecy. That's the 5th thing, and that's just to complete the fulfillment of all prophecies. And then the last is to anoint the most holy place. And that is the holy place of the temple would be restored, and the Holy One would be seated on the throne. And so those are the purposes of the 70 weeks. And the starting point of this prophecy is the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So what is that decree then? So there are 3 possible decrees. And when we look at history, first of all, there was a decree of Cyrus that was issued in 537 BC. And that decree was so that the Jews could rebuild their temple. And we see those events related in Ezra, the book of Ezra, and chapters 1 and verses 2 through 4 specifically are related to that decree. There's a second decree by Artaxerxes that was given in 458 BC. And that decree was for the establishment and practice of proper services at the temple. And again, this is mentioned in Ezra in relation to establishing the worship system in the temple and all of that. And then there was another decree given by Artaxerxes on March the 5th, 444 BC. And that decree was to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. And if you look in the book of Nehemiah, that describes Nehemiah and the group of Israelites going back and rebuilding the city. And remember, they had a lot of difficulty in doing that, didn't they? There were Sanballat and the others that were giving them a hard time while they were trying to rebuild the city. But that's the decree that starts the 70 weeks. That's when the clock starts, because that's the only decree to rebuild Jerusalem. So from the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 and 72 weeks. So the ending point then of there is until Messiah the Prince. And so this is referring to the triumphal entry of Jesus Christ. When Jesus came in, just before he was crucified, he came and presented himself as the Messiah. That's what the triumphal entry is all about. He was presenting himself to the nation of Israel as the Messiah. And they ended up rejecting him and crucifying him. But if you do the math, the calculation, you find out that it's exactly 69 weeks from the time of that decree on March the 5th, 444 BC, until the triumphal entry in AD 33. That works out to exactly 480 years, 490 years. But it works out just right on the dot. And remember, when Jesus came in and presented himself to Jerusalem, in the triumphal entry, what was it that he said? He wept over Jerusalem, and what was it that he said?
He said, your house is empty, you're desolate.
Well, he said that, but he said, if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they've been hidden from your eyes because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. So if they had been paying attention to prophecy, and if they'd been paying attention to God's word, they would have known exactly that Jesus was the Messiah, because that math works out exactly to when Jesus came and presented himself as the Messiah, just as Daniel's prophecy foretold. So again, Bible prophecy is very accurate and very detailed in many cases. And so they would have known exactly the time of the Messiah's coming. And so that was the fulfillment of the first 69 weeks, and now there's a gap between the 69th and the 70th week. And we see that mentioned in verse 26. After the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. And so after the 62 weeks is the phrasing, not during that time, but after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off. So the 62 weeks were fulfilled at the triumphal entry. After that, several days after, Jesus was crucified and he was cut off. And that's what it's talking about here. And then he says, then the people of the prince to come. And so the prince to come is a reference to the Antichrist. And he says the people of the prince to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. That's Jerusalem. So in AD 70, the temple was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed. This was prophesied by Daniel. And it was done by the Romans. So that tells us, that gives us a guideline about who the Antichrist is going to be. He's not going to be a Jew. He will be a descendant of the Roman Empire because he is the prince of the people that will come. Or the prince to come is the people of the prince to come. And so the Antichrist will be someone of European descent and in some relation to the Roman Empire. Now, if this event was intended to occur in the 70th week, then the text would read, during or in the midst of that time, the people will, people that will, or the prince of the people that will come will destroy the city and sanctuary. But that's not what it says. It says after. And so the 70th week doesn't follow immediately. If we look at the grammatical structure, it doesn't follow immediately the 69 weeks, because two things at least have to happen between the 69th and 70th week. And so that means there's some sort of a time gap. And so we don't know exactly how long that time gap is, but it turns out it's been over 2,000 years now. But we are living in that gap between the 69th and 70th week. Now, the time gap will end at the rapture, because when the rapture occurs, that's what is going to usher in these end-time events. And the tribulation will actually start when the Antichrist signs a treaty with Israel for 7 years. So that's when the 7-year countdown of the tribulation starts. But that will take place shortly after the rapture. And if you think about it, when millions of people just disappear like that, all right, think of the economic impact that's going to happen. Businesses, Christian business owners are going to be gone. So their businesses are going to shut down. A lot of Christian workers will be gone. So imagine if a good portion of your company disappeared. How would your company be able to function, right? So that's going to have an impact. There's going to be a lot of economic impact in relation to that, because you've got all of these Christians who are gone, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of mortgages that go into default, bankruptcies, likely there's going to be house fires, because there may be people cooking when the rapture occurs.
Wow.
And so the stove gets left on, could lead to a house fire, car accidents, all sorts of things are going to happen as a result of the rapture. And so there's going to be a lot of upheaval as a result of that, and there's going to be a vacuum of power in government, because even within government, not too many Christians anymore.
They're all still standing here.
we had some, at least in the last administration, but there's going to be vacuum and a lot of upheaval. So that will usher in the entrance of somebody like the Antichrist, who will have the answers and be able to provide, or claim to provide the solution for all of these things. So anyway, all of that's going to happen in between those two, and then the Antichrist is mentioned in verse 27. He's going to make a 7-year covenant, that is 1 week, covenant with the Jews, and that defines the length of the tribulation for us, 7 years. And then it's mentioned, the abomination of desolation is mentioned. And that's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation period. The Antichrist will break the treaty that he signed with the Jews, and he will desecrate the temple and set himself up as God and demand to be worshipped. And so we'll look at all of those events in detail in the coming weeks. But that's the timeline that Daniel lays out for us in this prophecy. And so you can see this gives us a framework and where we can fit. It's sort of like the frame of a house, and you can fit in the walls and the roof and all that built on that frame. And so he'll make that 7-year covenant, and then we've got that abomination of desolation. Now, let's do a real quick survey of prophetic events. We're not going to look in a lot of detail, but this is just a timeline of what we're going to be looking for. So you've got this chart in your notes, okay? You are here. All the signs you see. So you are here in the church age. All right? So we're in that gap between the 69th and 70th week. All the Old Testament stuff is happening right back here, okay? So this starts with the church age where we're at. And so, actually, let's just go through. So we talked about the dispensation of the church age already in the past. And the key event, of course, is the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And Jesus established his church. Then the next thing to happen is the rapture. So this, of course, is taken from a pre-tribulational, premillennial perspective, which is what I believe the Bible teaches very plainly. So the next thing to happen on the prophetic timeline is the rapture. And we don't know exactly when that's going to occur, but that is the next event. And at that time, all believers will be taken up to heaven, and the restraining power of the Holy Spirit and the restraining influence of believers will also be removed. So, you know, we think things are pretty bad right now in the world, but believers and Christians have some influence in restraining sin. And so that restraint will be removed. So if you think it's bad now, imagine what it's going to be like with nobody to speak out against immorality and all of these things. So that's what the tribulation period is going to be like. So Jesus will come. Up in heaven, we're going to be at the judgment seat of Christ during this time period, and that's when believers will be judged for our works. We'll receive rewards for the works that we've done in this life, and we're going to look at those in detail as well. Now, something that's not on this chart, but that's mentioned is in Ezekiel 38 and 39. There's a recording of a war. It's called the Battle of Gog and Magog. And in the Battle of Gog and Magog, a number of forces come against Israel, and God will miraculously deliver Israel from that attack. Now, how many of you have seen the Left Behind movie with Kirk Cameron? Has everybody seen that? So, if you remember at the beginning of that movie, Russia was attacking Israel, and the fighter planes just sort of got shut down and disappeared out of the sky, and Israel hadn't mounted any kind of defense. That's what happens in the Battle of Gog and Magog. God will supernaturally deliver Israel from this attack. Now, we don't know exactly when that is going to happen on the timeline. Some people put it before the rapture. Some people put it right after the rapture. Some people put it in the middle of the tribulation period. It's a separate battle from the Battle of Armageddon. Now, I personally think that the Battle of Gog and Magog will happen right after the rapture, and it will help set up the 7-year peace treaty with the Antichrist. My reasoning for that is because if it happens before the rapture, that would give us believers a real good clue that things are going to be happening very quickly, and it affects the imminency of the rapture. And we talked about that previously. So the rapture is imminent, and that means we don't know when it's going to happen, and we don't really have any signs. So to me, the Battle of Gog and Magog would be a hamper the imminency. Ezekiel records God's going to destroy 5/6 of the military force of Russia, and Russia and her allies, so the main ones attacking. And it's going to take 7 months to bury the dead and 7 years to dismantle the military equipment from that particular battle. So my thinking is if you place it in the middle or toward the end, they're still going to be doing that on into the millennium. And I don't think that's going to occur. So I put it toward it at the beginning, but others have different opinion, and that's fine. But anyway, we've got the 7-year tribulation period is the main thing. And of course, there are a number of different signs, different judgments that God's going to bring upon the world. But the last half of the tribulation period is where the judgments really get ramped up, and where a lot of things seriously happen, and a large portion of the world will be killed in those different judgments. And we're going to look at those in detail. And then at the end of the tribulation period is the Battle of Armageddon, or really it's a campaign of Armageddon, if you look at it, because it's not just a single battle. It sort of culminates all over the land of Israel, but it culminates in the second coming of Christ. All of the forces are going to be coming against the Antichrist, and in the middle of that battle, Jesus is going to return, and he's going to just wipe out the armies and level them all. And then he's going to land, set his feet on the Mount of Olives, and from there is the establishment of his kingdom. And so that is the second coming of Christ. And after he comes, he will judge the nations. That's mentioned in Matthew 25. Nations will be judged based on how they treated Israel during the tribulation period. And then God will establish the kingdom age and the millennial reign, which is 1,000 years. And then at the end of that 1,000 years, well, at the beginning of that, after the judgment of the nations, the Antichrist and the false prophet are going to be cast into the lake of fire. Satan will be bound and put into the pit for 1,000 years. So in the millennium, Satan's influence will be completely gone. He will be bound for 1,000 years. And then at the end of that, Satan is released for a short time. He gathers up a bunch of people because there's still going to be sinners during the millennium, and they go for a final battle against God, where they are defeated. Satan is cast into the lake of fire, and the great white throne judgment happens, and that's when all believers, all the dead unbelievers are raised and brought before God in judgment, and those are cast into the lake of fire. And then we have the new heaven and the new earth, and we go into eternity future. And so that's a jet trip through the prophetic timeline. But that's what we'll be looking at in detail over the coming weeks.